My name is Jörg Markovic, and I'm working here for 3S, which is a research and consultancy company based in Vienna. We mainly work for international clients, such as the European Commission, the International Labour Organization, or CEDEFOP, which is a French acronym for the European Centre for the Development of Vocational Training. Now, if you want to get a broad picture of the vocational education landscape in Europe, there are two indicators you should look at. The one is the relevance of vocational education in general, usually measured by the VET population in relation to the general education population at upper secondary level. Now, what you can see in this slide is, as I said, on the horizontal line, the share of vocational education and training at upper secondary level. And on the vertical line, you can see the share of those students who are in work-based learning programs. Now, this gives you different country groups. So, for instance, how to read this diagram, you can see that Austria, the Netherlands, or Switzerland at the top, and Finland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia at the bottom line, they all have very high shares of vocational education and training. Usually, more than 2 out of 3 students at upper secondary level are in vocational education programs. Now, if you look at the upper area of the slide, you see Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. And these are the ones where the share of work-based learning within this population is extremely high, so above 80–90%. Actually, in Denmark, everyone who is in a vocational program is in an apprenticeship. That's why it comes up on the top here. But interestingly, and that I think from a UK perspective is interesting when you try to compare now institutions in the UK with institutions in other countries of Europe, is first of all how Switzerland stands out. Switzerland is in the one quadrant where a high share of VET students you can find on upper secondary level on the one hand. On the other hand, most of them are in apprenticeship. A third indicator, which you couldn't see in the slide previously, which is important to look at, is the socio-demographic background of VET students. Now, in particular, their age. You can see on this figure the percentage of VET students who are 25 years or older. And from that picture, you can see that there are quite big differences. So there are countries or systems which are more or less adult-centered VET systems, like for instance in Finland, in Ireland, or also in Sweden, but even in Spain or Denmark. And then there are youth-centered VET systems, in particular the Austrian one, but also in the Czech Republic, France, Italy. These are very youth-centered. The average age of starting an apprenticeship in Austria is 16 years. Austria has among, I think, the youngest apprentices worldwide, followed probably by Egypt, but even in Germany, already apprentices are usually older. This 19 years when they start an apprenticeship. In Denmark, they're 21 when they start an apprenticeship. But in Finland, the average age, for instance, is 36. So there are schools which go back to the early 20th century, the first part-time VET schools in Vienna, for instance. There has been a huge educational expansion throughout the 1960s and 70s with a number of new vocational schools built during that time. And then we, of course, have very modern vocational schools which have only been built in the last 10 or 20 years. What we compared here is the size of the institutions. And what you can see from the slide, the darker the bars are, so to say, the bigger the institutions are in those countries. Now, institutions in the UK are particularly large, and only in the Netherlands or in Finland you would find a comparable sample of large VET institutions. Now, the number of VET schools in the last 2 to 3 decades also decreased in most member states, because often institutions were merged into larger network institutions and became larger and larger. Also, it is important to note that those institutions now have much more autonomy than they had 10, 20 or 30 years back. By autonomy, I mean both curricular autonomy, but also autonomy in terms of staff, and increasingly also in terms of the financing. But still there are big differences. So for instance, in Austria, a school, a VT school, can't fail financially, whereas in Denmark, it could face bankruptcy. Namely, the combination of learning in school with learning at the workplace has now transformed from 2 learning venues into 4 learning venues. So in countries like Switzerland, Austria, or also Germany, in addition to the school and the workplace, so-called intercompany training centers or industry training centers have been established. Those are centers where usually industries come together and provide equipment which schools, for instance, cannot afford to, and students learn some specific technical skills in those centers which they would not be able to learn in the vet school. And now, what is the 4th learning venue? Well, the 4th learning venue is simply the simulated learning environment, which is becoming more and more frequent nowadays. So there are actually 4 learning venues a VT student faces today. It's usually the school, the workplace or the job, an intercompany training center maybe, or an industry training center, and a simulated learning environment or virtual learning environment. And I think nowadays, teaching and managing vocational education and training is a lot about organizing these 4 learning venues.